Hi there. So we're going to be trying something new today. Instead of doing a lecture in class, I'm just going to go through some of these slides with you and highlight a few things with some narration, and you can listen to this as many times as you need to and kind of just go from there. So where we last left off, we were actually talking about war with France. So if you remember, Hamilton is raising an army. He is going to use this army to fight France. France has disrespected us with the XYZ affair, where they want us to negotiate for peace, but we have to pay to do it. And if you remember, I told you John Adams actually refuses to declare war and disbands that army. But I kind of want to talk about how we get to this point. And part of that has to do with the Alien and Sedition Acts. So, as you can see from the screen, the Alien Act is targeted at immigrants, but it's really only targeted at French immigrants. So, these are people that are coming to the United States and trying to agitate support for the French Revolution. And of course, we don't want to support the French Revolution because that would mean that we're taking sides with France, and that isn't what we want to do at this point. Also, you notice the Sedition Act, again, that is only geared at Republicans. So if you are a Republican and you are speaking out against John Adams and the federal government, if you are a Republican newspaper and you are publishing articles that go against the government, you can get thrown in jail for that. And I want you to understand that this is really only kind of geared towards the Republicans. This is a way of the Federalist government to control the Republicans and try to keep power. Obviously, the Republicans aren't going to like that, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison kind of step up and draft a response. So the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions basically are the Republican response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and you can see that Jefferson, and through Madison, Jefferson's words, they really feel that it is the state's job to protect the citizens, that the states had the power after the Revolution. They gave it to the federal government because the Articles of Confederation didn't work, and we wrote the Constitution to kind of give us a stronger national government. But at any point in time, if that government gets too powerful, the states can take it back. Jefferson really doesn't get anywhere with this, but what does happen is that people read what Jefferson is saying and they're like, oh yeah, I kind of agree with that. And Jefferson kind of molds himself into a populist candidate a la Donald Trump. And as you can see, Jefferson really rides this wave of populism into the election of 1800. And the election of 1800 is kind of interesting because, as you'll see, there's a tie. Now, some background here. Jefferson was supposed to be the person that was on the ticket as president. Aaron Burr was supposed to be on the ticket as vice president. As you can kind of see, Adams and Pinckney were the same way. What happens, though, is that the Republicans all vote for Jefferson and Burr, and also some Federalists vote for Burr to kind of stick it to Jefferson. What happens is a constitutional crisis because we don't have a provision for a tie. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says that if there's not a winner, it goes to the House of Representatives, but it doesn't specify what happens if there's a tie. It goes to the House, and if you remember at this time, if you are elected in November, you don't take office until March. So many people who are in the House who are Republicans who are losing their seats in March stall this process. There's over 25 votes, and we don't have a winner until February. So if you can imagine today, if we had an election in November and we didn't know the winner until February, how that would make people feel. What happens is, in the end, Hamilton makes a backroom deal with Jefferson, and Hamilton pledges his support to Jefferson. And once Hamilton does that, the votes come through finally on the 25th vote for Jefferson. And this is important two ways. First of all, you see that the Republicans now have the White House, but also this kind of starts the duel between Hamilton and Burr. Hamilton doesn't like Burr. Hamilton feels that Burr is kind of dumb. He's boisterous. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not civilized. And this kind of starts the bad blood between Burr and Hamilton. And you'll see that Hamilton is going to publicly campaign against Burr for other races coming up. And this is really going to be the start of the end for Alexander Hamilton. So why do I care about the election of 1800? Well, first of all, I think it is very important that you understand that the United States was literally on the verge of civil war. That doesn't happen because Adams and Hamilton kind of lick their wounds and back the Republicans. It's a peaceful transfer, and there's a lot of hype, and it's very anticlimactic in the end. Also, the United States stays out of an international war, so we're not at war with Britain, we're not at war with France, we're not allied with anybody, we're just us. And you really don't see this shift other than in 1965 when the radical Republicans take over after the Civil War, and in 1932 when the Democrats completely take over the House from the Republicans after the Great Depression. So this is a very big deal because we don't see this sort of peaceful transition of power later on in our history. So let's talk about the United States in 1800, and you'll notice that you're starting to see states in the West. This is important because before it is North versus South, so you have that New England versus Chesapeake mentality, and the South is really dominating because they have a lot more population, they have a lot more money. As the population moves west, though, those advantages start to shift. People are moving out of the South to the West because all the land is being held by wealthy landowners. And what are they doing in the West? They're farming. Well, the South doesn't need farmed goods because they already farm. So what's happening is that the West starts allying with the North. And the North uses the West as kind of a cheaper alternative to the South. And the North builds the infrastructure westward. And you're starting to see the North and the West kind of ally together against the South. And at the same time, the South is going to lose population and influence in the government. This is going to be very important later. But for right now, just understand that the West is shifting the dynamics in the federal government. Let's talk about my man Jefferson as president. So again, I told you Jefferson is kind of like the original Donald Trump. He's very populist. He's very much a man of the people. He very much bills himself as someone who cares about the common man. And if you notice from the picture, he takes great lengths to go out and prove that he's poor. In reality, Jefferson is one of the richest people in the country at this time, but you'll notice he's wearing a fur coat. That is by design. Jefferson also famously goes to his inauguration, not in a carriage, but walking and shaking hands with people. If you can imagine if Barack Obama would have walked from the Capitol building to the White House, just imagine the security issues that would bring up. But in 1801, Jefferson is seen as idealistic, and he's seen as a breath of fresh air. As Jefferson, though, starts becoming president, he realizes that all of his Republican ideals don't really work in a federal government. The national government has to have control over certain things or else nothing gets done. And you'll see going forward, Jefferson is going to start to abandon his Republican ideals and keep more Federalist ideals. The big thing here is the Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson originally wants to buy New Orleans from France. France is fighting in Haiti. You might have remembered this from Mr. Daly's class, the Haitian Revolution. France needs cash quick. So Jefferson originally has people go to buy New Orleans, and they're going to buy New Orleans for $5 million. France shoots back, hey, we'll give you the entire Louisiana territory for 15. Jefferson goes with that deal. He acts quickly. He does not ask for congressional approval, and he just does it because this deal is a one-time deal. Congress is mad because if you read the Constitution, that sounds like something that Congress would do and not the president, but Jefferson argues that it was necessary and proper. Therefore, he had the right to do it. He was negotiating with France, therefore he was qualified to make the deal. And this is kind of where we get the phrase executive decision. You'll also see that Jefferson is really going against his ideals because he denies Louisiana the opportunity to make decisions themselves. Instead, he makes the decisions for Louisiana. And again, he rationalizes this by saying that it is what's best for the security of the country, not necessarily and that's why it's what's best for the people. You'll also see that he authorizes wars against the Barbary states, and he's going to authorize an embargo against France and Britain. So you're seeing things that Jefferson, who is being very hands-on, even though he said in the 1790s, he does not believe on being hands-on. Some other big things that you need to know during the early 1800s is Madison versus Marbury. Now, this is going to be extremely important going forward, especially in government and especially in some of the other classes as we go forward. Marbury versus Madison gives us judicial review. And you don't really need to know the story behind Marbury versus Madison, although William Marbury was appointed by John Adams right before the end of his term. Marbury is supposed to get a post. Jefferson comes in and says, no, I want James Madison for this post. And Marbury sues saying, hey, I was promised this post. You can't just change it. The court actually looks at the Judiciary Act of 1801 and says that, you know what, Marbury, you were wronged, but based on the Judiciary Act of 1801, you should have got that job. However, we find that the Judiciary Act of 1801 is not constitutional, and therefore we give ourselves the power to strike this law down and any other law going forward. So the Supreme Court gets their biggest check that's not even in the Constitution based on this court case. So again, all you need to really know, Marbury v. Madison equals judicial review. And you better remember judicial review because I'm going to ask you about it every day in AP Government next year. Here's a cool slide about Burr versus Hamilton. If you've seen Hamilton the musical, you'll know that Hamilton is shot by Aaron Burr, and it kind of goes through the election of 1800 and that Hamilton backed Jefferson over Burr, and there's kind of bad blood. Hamilton also is going to campaign against Burr for the New York governor. And kind of a cool little story if you read. Burr is charged with murder and flees, kind of tries to set up his own de facto government in Mexico, what is now Mexico. And he is acquitted by John Marshall with the support of Thomas Jefferson. And this is kind of one of those things where Thomas Jefferson wants to do something, but again, he is thwarted by his nemesis, John Marshall. Also, keep in mind the Three-Fifths Compromise. At this time, 60% of slaves are being counted towards the southern states' population. But the slave trade was abolished in 1808. This is important because when the Constitution was written, the thought was that slavery was going out of style, it was dying, it was not practical, and the statistics really do back this up. However, between the writing of the Constitution in 1808, the cotton gin is invented. And of course, this makes slavery profitable again and boosts slavery more than ever. But know the Three-Fifths Compromise, again, 60% of slaves counted towards Southern populations, even though they were not given a vote in, or even though they were not given citizen rights, they were counted as citizens. Jefferson steps down after 2 terms, just like his pal Washington, and his successor that he names is James Madison. Okay, and Madison really wants to keep a lot of Jefferson's policies other than the Embargo Act. What you see, though, is that Madison, like the Republican that he is, slowly shifts our alliances to France. Britain doesn't like this, so they kind of incite the Native Americans to fight against us on our border. And what happens is that the tide really shifts against the British. So remember, we were talking in last class about how we don't want to pick a side between mom and dad. Well, we're already starting to go towards mom is France, dad is Great Britain. So we're already trying to go towards mom. Now we're really ticked at dad because he's inciting Native American riots on our own soil. So we are really against the British at this point in time. This is going to lead to war. The War of 1812 is seen by many as a second war of independence, and it is very much a war between the United States and Britain. What's interesting for you to know is that the United States initially declares war because they want Canada. So we're going to invade Canada. We're going to completely remove the British from the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, that doesn't go very well for us. Britain is still the biggest, baddest army on the planet at this time. And for the first year and a half, things do not go well, particularly because the Federalists make it almost impossible for us to raise an army. Also, the Federalists make it almost impossible for the United States to set up a response. So what you're seeing is that the biggest, baddest army on the planet is winning battles, and the United States is really not fighting back because they're deadlocked between the Federalists and the Republicans. And you'll see that the White House is burned down. The Battle of Fort McHenry is where the Star-Spangled Banner comes from because, after the fort is shelled the entire night, the United States flag is still there. And of course, at the bottom, Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison kind of emerge as war leaders, and these guys will become president later on. The Hartford Convention is really the last hoorah for the Federalists. So the Federalists don't feel that the war is going well. They don't feel that we should be fighting this war in the first place. So they call a constitutional convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. And if you look at some of these amendments, they're not that far out of reason. A 2/3 vote for declaration of war probably would be a good thing. Not counting slaves towards the state's population. Again, probably not what we should be doing. But many of these are geared towards curbing the Republicans and their influence and getting influence back for the Federalists. And if they don't get their demands from the Republicans, then the New England states threaten to secede and join Canada and fight for the British. This really doesn't look good for the Federalists on surface. And when the United States starts winning battles, suddenly they are seen as traitors. And after the Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party effectively dies. So no more Federalists. The Republicans win the battle, they win the war, and they are effectively the only party left after the War of 1812. Basically, the War of 1812 solves absolutely nothing. Britain and France agreed to stop, or sorry, Britain and the United States agreed to stop fighting. Basically, no territory is exchanged, and the Federalists lose any power in the federal government that they used to have. In fact, the Federalist Party, like I just said, dies. It goes away, and we become a one-party system for the next 2 decades. What is interesting about the War of 1812, though, is that the United States kind of sees this as, hey, we stood up against Big Brother and we didn't completely get defeated. So that's cool, right? So that's the War of 1812. That is the Federalists versus Republicans, and this will help you with your DBQ going forward. Thank you and have a wonderful day and or evening.